Okay, today I want to talk about how to spot values that you hold, personal values that are not, in fact, your values. They are values that were inherited by you. We've talked about the consequences of not having a personal value system that you have a conscious connection to. We've talked about what personal values are. We've talked about how to deconstruct values that aren't yours. Now, today I want to talk about how to spot values that aren't yours. Because most values are not actually chosen. Most values are just absorbed. You internalize them through repeated exposure, through family and school and social environments, not through explicit adoption, saying, this is what I believe. And over time, these patterns start to govern your preferences and your judgments and your actions and your choices and your sense of what feels right. You don't just sit down and agree to what your personal value system is that you've inherited. You start just acting before you could even evaluate them. So when people talk about finding their values or what their personal values are, what they often mean is they're trying to make sense of why their current set of values no longer works for them. And the friction comes when the values that you've held for years, they stop delivering clarity to you and start creating confusion and chaos and complexity in your life. And you try to act in line with what you say you believe, and the result is hesitation and contradiction or exhaustion. You're conflicted because the structure was never stable to begin with. You grew up thinking you know what certain values mean. So, for example, we hear like a very popular conception of values is family values. Family values. That sounds like loyalty and care and consistency and being there for you. But over time, what that package of beliefs can actually mean is silence and obligation and control. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with family values. It's just how we package these values in our minds, and there's a gap between what these packages are marketed to mean and what these packages translate to mean in our daily lives and interactions with people and how they actually guide us, right? You're told, for example, in the family values system, to value honesty, but only if it doesn't embarrass anyone. You're told to value stability, but only if it looks like compliance. And then on the other side, you've got something like on the progressive side of things, you've got maybe the values of authenticity or inclusion. But in practice, they can start to feel like postures that you have to maintain to stay in alignment with your group. Not because you're lying, but because you never really chose what those words meant. You just absorbed them. You said them back and you kept going. And it worked for you until it maybe didn't work for you. And now you're not sure which values are yours and which were installed. And there's this incentive structure really not to question things or not to go too off course from the mainstream, because if you do, you could be jeopardizing the survival structures that are in place for you, belonging with a certain community or social group. If you question things too much in any group, you risk exclusion. And so there's an incentive. The incentive is for everybody in the world to inherit their values without question. The person who critically engages with the value system they've inherited, that is part of what binds them to a specific community or social group, that person is acting against the incentive structures put in place for them, which is why it's a brave act, and it's also why it's a difficult act. So that's what I want to talk about today. Not how to reject the values that you inherited from your family or your upbringing, but how to identify which values that you did inherit that don't hold up for you and don't serve you now, and why. So let's move into this place of initially identifying what a false value is, or what an inherited value is that might not be working. Here I want to talk about this concept of when values become performance, because a performative value isn't necessarily a false value. right? Just because you feel like you're faking it, or just because this value doesn't feel authentic to you, it doesn't mean it's a bad value. It's just context sensitive. So this value only governs your actions when you expect someone to be watching. That's what makes a value performative, either explicitly or implicitly. So you say that you value truth until truth makes you look rude, and then you don't value truth, right? Or you say you value kindness until kindness makes you feel like a doormat, makes you feel weak, and then you don't value kindness, right? Then something else takes over. Another you comes out. Not because you're a liar or because you're mean, but because the value has tuned for the value was tuned for coherence, not resistance. So, in John Stuart Mill, in his book On Liberty, he described conformity as a deeper threat to freedom than tyranny. He called it the despotism of custom. The norms you never notice are often the ones you obey the most. So when a value survives only under social reinforcement, it isn't embedded, it's a rented value. That's how values disappear, not in contradiction, but in fatigue. And then we move from when values become performative to when they become actually self-deceptive. So Bernard Williams, in his book Truth and Truthfulness, writes that the real threat to moral clarity is not hypocrisy. The real threat to moral clarity is the quiet engineering of one's life to avoid difficult truths. And self-deception is not a conscious lie. That's kind of the paradox of self-deception. Self-deception is a pattern of avoidance. It's a way of arranging your commitments so that certain conflicts never arise in your life. So you say you value generosity, but it never actually costs you anything. You say you value integrity, but only when it aligns like with your image. You say you value independence, but your life is structured around these unspoken loops of getting other people's approval. These aren't violations per se, they're design features of your life. They allow you to feel like you're this kind of person and act like you're this kind of person. Which means that the structure isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was supposed to do, which is protect a version of selfhood that's optimized for minimal contradiction, without doing the integrative work of coherence. And coherence is often the confrontation of those contradictory parts within ourselves. So now, when we have performative values on a deeper level, moving into self-deception, personal values as self-deception, we're deceiving ourselves. I value this, I value that, right? And we tell ourselves these things as personal values just become a prop in our own self-narration. But there's a deeper level even than that, which is that we have the illusion that we actually choose these values. We say these are mine, but they're still false. So most values, like we've talked about, are really not selected. They're just ambient. And you're told to be yourself and to know your values and to live with integrity, but only within the bounds of what's intelligible to your peer group or your professional ecosystem. So you're free to choose, but only from a known menu. If you go to, this is enforced in no more explicit place than in therapy. You go to therapy, and you, for example, I'm not getting this from anywhere. Talk about like overworking. That concept of overworking is a judgment from a value system. When it's like, rather than framing it as being committed and pursuing your goals, right? They're going to tell you, hey, you need to rest. This is not sustainable. You're working too hard, right? They have a bias towards pathologization and passivity and compassion, typically. And that value system is going to be in conflict with the value system of something that is more action oriented, and disciplined, and willpower. It's not going to be as It's not going to include actions, plans, behaviors that have high willpower cost, right? Because these tend to be high risk. And somebody with liability insurance is not going to want to engage in advice that is high risk. So your value systems are being given to you by professionals around you, from people around you, from friends around you. People don't want to give you values that is going to, fall back on them or come back on them or make them liable in some way. And so the values that you are given and encouraged to uphold are typically not necessarily the ones that are best for you. We have actually a whole series that we did on advice. What is bad advice? Why people give bad advice? Why we look for bad advice? A lot of the reasons we look for bad advice and get bad advice is because people don't value us and people do not care about our value system, and we don't care about our value system. Knowing what value system is yours is important. But this is why it's so dangerous to have what we think are chosen values, but in fact are not. We get to the point where we're like, oh, for sure, I know that I chose these values, but they're still inherited. They're still something that they're still not really ours, right? So, one of my favorite philosophers, Simone de Beauvoir, in her book, The Ethics of Ambiguity, she calls this thing where you're free to choose, but only from this known menu. She calls this bad faith, which is the illusion of choice in a framework whose terms you did not define. You say you've chosen your values, right? But could you have chosen something illegible? Could you have adopted something that alienates you from yourself rather than aligns you with yourself? If not, then what you call your values might just be permissions you're afraid to withdraw from because they feel safe and they feel secure. So bad faith for de Beauvoir is when we sit in that moral liminal space where we have to make a decision about what our values are, and we settle for something prefabricated because it's easy. We settle for prepackaged answers, right? And there's no problem with prepackaged answers, but at a certain point, if you really want to have a conscious ownership-like connection to the values that you say you have, you've got to take the long way to that value and not just accept them as something that you've received. So how exactly do you spot values that aren't yours? Well, I want to give like a little diagnostic framework, little 5-part diagnostic framework to help us out. Because values that aren't fully yours, the funny thing is, those values that you've inherited don't feel false to you. That's the thing, is you think, wow, this value just doesn't feel like me. I'm not going to hold it anymore. That's usually not how this happens. What happens is values that are false to you, or maybe not true to who you are, feel exhausting. They still feel like you, but they feel exhausting. And you're not able to distinguish between them and yourself, which is often what gives rise to some of these warning signs that we'll talk about in a moment. So these values that aren't fully you, but that you've inherited and feel like you have to hold them in place. You defend them more than you live them. You try to integrate them, but they won't metabolize. And what emerges instead is this emotional drag, where you have these compensatory efforts that don't really lead to any more moral traction. So I want to draw on a theory. It's Thomas Scheff's theory of emotional coherence and pseudo self-regulation. And here's the diagnostic frame he gives us that I think we can just bring right in to a diagnostic for identifying values that are inherited and false to us. So Scheff's theory of emotional coherence and pseudo self-regulation. He says, number one diagnostic is that you have chronic fatigue around moral decision-making. So you feel drained by choices that shouldn't require that much effort. You're maintaining a structure that you haven't fully accepted, right? So chronic fatigue around moral decision-making. Number two, you have guilt without clarity. You feel morally wrong, but can't explain why. That's often a borrowed value running unexamined. Number 3, relief after transgression. So you violate a rule and feel lighter, not worse. This usually means the value is performative in the first place. So you've got chronic fatigue around moral decision making, guilt without clarity, relief after transgression. Number 4, you have a pattern of moral improvisation. So your values change tone depending on who you're around. This is not adaptability, this is instability. And then 5, you have conflicting attachments. So you believe one thing, but consistently choose another thing. Not because you're confused, but because the stated value doesn't hold functional weight, right? So you've got chronic fatigue around moral decision-making, guilt without clarity, relief after transgression, a pattern of moral improvisation, and conflicting attachments. These are not psychological failures. They're structural signals that the system that you've been trying to live inside was not authored by you. It was merely accepted by you. So, what structural insight can we take from this method of identifying inherited values that are not true to us? The test of a value, the test of a personal value, is not whether you believe it. It's whether it holds when nothing reinforces it. Socially, emotionally, narratively, all of these things abandon you. Your incentive structures abandon you, but you think, no, I'm doing this anyway. Because intrinsically, I feel compelled to do so in a way that truly does feel true to me. Right? Real values create resistance. They eliminate options. They assert boundaries without an appeal to image or external approval. In contrast, borrowed values collapse under friction. Performative values dissolve when they are invisible. And unranked values fail when they are contested by life. And what remains is what you've chosen through pressure. The goal is to just make those choices and the underlying rationale behind them explicit and call that your value system. Those are the things that you keep without any applause at all from anybody else. So going back to Simone de Beauvoir's concept of bad faith, right? She calls this bad faith when you mistake optional performance for authorship. But the deeper danger of acting out personal values that you've merely inherited, the deeper danger is not performance. It's unexamined legibility. The more a value depends on reinforcement to function, the less it is a value. If a value requires alignment, recognition, or feedback to persist, it isn't structurally sound for you. It's just ambient conformity, right? It's going back to John Stuart Mill, like the despot of custom, pretending to be freedom. So this is the contradiction. You think you're free because you're choosing your values, but you're still choosing from within a map somebody else built for you. One that punishes illegibility within their system and rewards coherence within their system. And until you're willing to choose what doesn't explain you well to others, you are not building your own personal value system. You're merely rehearsing someone else's.